July 16, 1950. Evening settles over Rio de Janeiro like a heavy golden curtain. The heat lingers above the Maracana, shimmering over a sea of humanity, 200,000 strong, beating as one colossal heart. Brazil is on the brink of destiny. For weeks, the newspapers have screamed the same truth. O Brasil será campeão do mundo. Brazil will be world champion. Every street corner in Rio hums with samba and certainty. Children wear homemade crowns of yellow and green paper. Vendors shout and wave miniature flags. Radios buzz with optimism. Every word an anthem, every beat a promise. Brazil doesn't just believe it will win, it believes it must. The new republic has risen from political chaos and global war, and football has become its heartbeat, a declaration that Brazil has arrived among the great nations of the world. The Maracana itself, built in a fever of pride and ambition, is more cathedral than stadium. Fresh concrete and paint cling to the air, banners ripple like waves in the humid breeze. Above it all, a German man, once an officer in a vanished empire, sits quietly in the very important person section, invited by a diplomat friend. He's a ghost among the living, a relic of Europe's ruins, now witnessing the new world's greatest festival. To him, this night feels strangely familiar. Flags, songs, hope, and the unmistakable scent of hubris. Below, the players march out. The white-clad Brazilians shimmer under the lights. Elegant, effortless. The captain, Augusto, nods to his men. Ademir de Menezes, the tournament's top scorer, adjusts his armband. Zizinho, Brazil's genius playmaker, flashes a confident grin. The air trembles with drums, trumpets, and the chant, Brasil, Brasil, Brasil. Across the halfway line, the Uruguayans stand motionless. Their sky-blue shirts look pale under the blaze of light. Obdulio Varela, the captain, broad, stoic, eyes of steel, studies the field as if memorizing enemy positions. Around him, teammates murmur in Spanish, voices swallowed by the roar. They know the numbers. They know that Brazil needs only a draw to be world champion. And yet, they also know something the crowd does not. Fear can be louder than celebration. The referee's whistle pierces the air. Instantly, Brazil explodes into motion. Their passes are poetry, flowing triangles, constant movement, unrelenting rhythm. Zizinho glides past defenders. Jair charges down the wing. The German watches with the same awe that swept through Europe when he saw the first tanks roll across borders, unstoppable, inevitable. But he also recognizes the arrogance in their perfection. He can see the gaps, small but real, moments where Uruguay's quiet defiance begins to breathe. For 45 minutes, Brazil dominates. The crowd sings louder with every near miss. When Friaca's shot finally hits the back of the net early in the second half, the stadium erupts. The noise is unbearable, pure, human thunder. Flags whirl, people cry, strangers embrace. The announcer's voice booms, already declaring victory. Brazil leads, the champions of the world. But then, the rhythm falters. Something small, almost invisible happens. Obdulio Varela walks to the ball, slow, too slow. He picks it up, tucks it under his arm, and begins to argue with the referee. His teammates don't move. His protest drags on. A minute, 2, 3. The crowd whistles, jeers, demands the game resume. But Varela isn't arguing about a foul. He's doing something far more dangerous. He's giving his team time to breathe, to think, to feel the crowd's noise turn from triumph into tension. The German notices it. This tiny rebellion in plain sight. He leans forward, watching Varela's face, the way he stares at the stands rather than the referee. The captain's expression is not anger, it's calculation. He's reminding his men that the ball and the moment still belong to them. When the match restarts, the atmosphere shifts. Brazil continues to attack, but the joy has gone. The passes grow hurried. The crowd, sensing unease, shouts louder, as if volume alone could restore control. Yet in that noise, Uruguay begins to rise, one steady pass at a time. The German exhales slowly. He's seen this before too. The moment when certainty turns into dread, when an army realizes the battle isn't over. Around him, Brazilian dignitaries are already preparing speeches. The photographers adjust their flashbulbs, but deep down, a few can sense it. Something's wrong. The air feels heavier now, the music fading under the weight of something unseen. History is shifting, quietly, invisibly, beneath their feet. In just half an hour, the Maracana will fall silent. 2 goals will rewrite destiny, and 200,000 voices will vanish in disbelief. A single man's defiance, a captain's slow walk with a football in his hands will turn triumph into tragedy. The German doesn't know it yet, but what he's watching tonight isn't just a game. It's a parable of pride, courage, and the brutal beauty of sport. Because sometimes, the gods of football choose their victims not for their sins, but for their perfection. And on this night, Brazil, the land of joy and rhythm, will learn the meaning of heartbreak. Long before the Maracana became a monument to heartbreak, it was meant to be a temple of triumph. The story begins not in 1950, but in the ashes of war, when the world was rebuilding, and football was becoming a symbol of peace, unity, and pride. For Brazil, football wasn't just a sport. It was identity. It was language, rhythm, and escape. In the 1930s and 40s, while Europe was consumed by conflict, Brazilian football was discovering its soul. Players like Leonidas da Silva, the Black Diamond, dazzled the world with creativity and grace. Yet the nation still craved validation, a moment to prove that its samba style could conquer the structured might of Europe. That moment seemed to arrive with the 1950 World Cup, the first held after the war and the first hosted by Brazil. The government saw it as more than a tournament. It was a declaration of modernity. Massive public works projects were launched to build the Maracana, a stadium so vast that it could hold the dreams of a continent. Newspapers called it O Maior do Mundo, the greatest in the world. And everywhere you went, the word destiny followed. School children were taught songs about victory. The press printed early editions of World Champion Brazil. The players, showered in adoration, became demigods in a country still wrestling with inequality and post-war poverty. At the heart of this rising golden age was a team unlike any before, beautiful, explosive, almost untouchable. Ademir de Menezes, the bald-headed striker from Pernambuco, had scored goals for fun all tournament long. Zizinho, the elegant playmaker, was the thinking man's idol, precise, creative, calm under pressure. Behind them, Jaya and Chico stretched defenses wide, their movement intoxicating to watch. Together they represented more than 11 men. They were the living proof of a nation's belief that joy could be power. But every hero's journey needs an enemy. And theirs came from across the River Plate. Uruguay, a country small enough to fit inside Brazil several times over, had been world champion once before, in 1930. They'd also won 2 Olympic gold medals. But by 1950, the world had forgotten their pedigree. Their players had day jobs. Their federation had limited resources. Even the Brazilian press dismissed them as relics of the past. Yet within Uruguay's camp, something deeper stirred. Their coach, Juan Lopez, was pragmatic, almost austere. He told his men to respect Brazil's talent, but not to fear it. And standing beside him was Obdulio Varela, the embodiment of defiance. Varela was unlike any captain Brazil had faced. He was older, grizzled, and carried the weight of the working class on his shoulders. Born in Montevideo to a humble Afro-Uruguayan family, he learned early that leadership was less about shouting and more about absorbing pressure, like a wall that refused to crack. He had a presence that quieted rooms. Teammates described him as both philosopher and fighter. When others complained about tactics or travel, Varela would sit silently, cleaning his boots, lost in thought. But when he spoke, every man listened. In the days leading up to the final, the Brazilian press printed caricatures of Uruguay's players, mocking them as lambs to the slaughter. Posters proclaimed, "Only a catastrophe can deny Brazil the title." The nation's confidence was absolute. But for Varela, those headlines weren't insults. They were fuel. On the night before the match, he gathered his teammates in their modest Rio hotel. Outside, fireworks echoed across the city as Brazilians began celebrating early. Inside, Varela poured coffee and said quietly, "Tomorrow, they're going to play with their crowd. We'll play with our hearts." The room fell silent. The men nodded. In that moment, Uruguay's team, dismissed, ridiculed and forgotten, became something else, a brotherhood. Back in Germany, the visiting officer who would soon watch them play had heard whispers about this Uruguayan captain. The locals spoke of him not as a footballer, but as a caudillo, a man of command. To the German, he sounded familiar, not a general, not a politician, but a natural leader born for crisis. The day before the final, Varela walked alone through Rio's streets. He passed newsstands plastered with "Brazil World Champion" in bold print. He bought one copy, folded it, and tucked it into his bag. Later, he would show it to his teammates before kickoff. "They think they've already won," he said, holding the newspaper aloft. "But we haven't played yet." That line, calm, almost casual, became Uruguay's mantra. While Brazil rehearsed their victory song, Uruguay rehearsed resilience. While Brazil saw the Maracana as a cathedral of triumph, Varela saw it as a colosseum. The difference was everything, because to the crowd of 200,000, this was a coronation. To Uruguay, it was war. By the morning of July 16, 1950, Rio de Janeiro was already awake. The city pulsed like a living drum. From the favelas to the glittering avenues of Copacabana, from the Amazon to Sao Paulo, one thought echoed through radios and open windows: today, Brazil becomes world champion. Thousands lined the streets outside the Maracana hours before kickoff, wrapped in flags and certainty. Vendors sold miniature trophies. Schoolchildren waved banners. Inside, the pitch shimmered in the midday sun, perfectly trimmed for the final act of Brazil's destiny. But destiny has a strange way of inviting doubt, quietly, invisibly. In the Uruguayan locker room, there was no music, no laughter. Just the rasp of boots on concrete and the whisper of nerves. The air felt heavy. The players sat in silence, aware that the noise outside was meant to crush them. Their coach, Juan Lopez, entered, his face calm but drawn. He looked around and said simply, "Boys, our plan is simple. We defend deep, we absorb, we counter when we can. If we leave here alive, it's enough." It was a tactical surrender, the voice of a realist, not a dreamer, but it was too much for Varela. The captain stood, eyes burning. He took a step forward. "If we play like cowards, we'll lose before we start," he said. The room froze. "I don't want 11 ghosts out there. I want men. If we're going to die, we die attacking." His teammates, Scafino, Gigia, Perez, Miguez, lifted their heads. The quiet murmur of belief began to ripple through the room. Varela wasn't dismissing the coach. He was redefining the mission. The German observer, sitting in a diplomatic box high in the stands, didn't know this conversation was happening below. But when the players walked out minutes later, he felt the difference. He saw the look in Varela's eyes. Not fear, but defiance. The match began as everyone expected. Brazil on the front foot, attacking in waves. Their 4-2-4 system, the most daring in the world, spread Uruguay thin. Ademir carved through defenders with ease. Zizinho, that magician in midfield, moved with the grace of a conductor, every pass a note in an orchestra of inevitability. By halftime, it was 0-0, but it felt like a siege. The crowd roared after every attack, every near miss. When the whistle blew for the break, the Brazilian players jogged to the locker room smiling, shaking hands with fans leaning over the railings. In the Uruguayan room, sweat and silence. Some players kept their heads down. Others stared into space, their legs trembling from the pressure. And then, once again, Varela spoke. "Listen," he said softly. "They think we're afraid. They think we're finished. Let them think it. But out there, we fight for every blade of grass. If one of us falls, another takes his place. We're not here for survival. We're here for history. He reached into his bag, pulled out the Brazilian newspaper he had bought. The day before, the one declaring Brazil world champion, and held it up. This, he said, is what they've written. Let's go out there and erase it. Those words hit like fire. The team rose, one by one, hearts pounding. The room vibrated with energy. Quiet, lethal conviction. As the second half began, something changed. Brazil scored first. Friaca's low drive slipped under Maspoli's reach. In the 47th minute, and the stadium exploded in joy. Fireworks cracked. Fans threw hats and flags into the air. But instead of despair, the Uruguayans watched their captain. Varela walked slowly to the ball, picked it up, and began his long, deliberate protest. The German in the stands noticed it too, that walk. It wasn't defiance, it was hypnosis. Every step stole momentum from the crowd. Every second drained Brazil's energy. For the players in sky blue, that walk was more than time wasting. It was transformation. They saw their captain's calm and felt their own fear dissolve. When play resumed, Uruguay looked different, disciplined, composed, no longer chasing shadows. They moved the ball with care, short passes, patient build-up. In the 66th minute, it happened. Gigia darted down the right flank, traded passes with Julio Perez, and sent in a low cross. Schiaffino met it first time, his shot slicing past Barbosa and into the roof of the net. The roar that followed wasn't Brazilian. It was defiance echoing from 11 hearts in sky blue. In that instant, the German leaned back, sensing it, the pendulum swinging. The noise of the crowd grew confused, half cheer, half shock. Brazil still led the group on goal difference, but something invisible had cracked. On the pitch, Varela raised his arms and called his men back, urging calm. He wasn't celebrating, he was commanding. "Quiet," he shouted. "Quiet. It's not over." The maracana trembled. The game had become something else, no longer spectacle but survival. From that point forward, every minute felt heavier. Brazil still had the flair, the pace, the talent, but not the same certainty. Every pass was chased by a hint of panic. Every touch haunted by the memory of that equalizer. In the stands, the German man could feel it too. That subtle, devastating change in energy. He'd seen armies lose wars in the same way, not because of strategy, but because belief evaporated. And down below, Obdulio Varela, the black captain from Montevideo, had become the conductor now, not Zizinho, not Ademir. Every beat of the game followed his rhythm. He was the calm inside the storm, the voice that whispered, "Not yet. Not finished." What none of them knew was that history still had one more twist left, one moment that would silence the world. The rise was complete. The fall was coming. By the 70th minute, the maracana had changed. The once thunderous chorus of voices had splintered into a nervous murmur. Brazil still held destiny in its hands. A draw would be enough, but destiny now felt fragile, trembling under the weight of 200,000 anxious hearts. The German man in the stands leaned forward, his fingers clasped, watching the shape of the battle unfold. He had seen fields of war turn on smaller moments than this, a single spark that spreads through an army like fire. On the pitch below, he saw that same flame flickering in the eyes of the men in sky blue. Uruguay had begun to press higher. Gigia, their slender winger, kept running at Bigode, Brazil's left back, a duel that had become both tactical and psychological. Each time Gigia received the ball, he feinted inside, forcing Bigode to retreat, step by step, toward his own penalty area. The crowd shouted for Bigode to attack, but fear had crept into his boots. Juan Alberto Schiaffino, calm and surgical, began dictating play from midfield. He wasn't the most vocal man, but his vision was extraordinary, the kind of intelligence that sees the pitch like a chessboard. Each of his passes carried intention. Each movement broke another thread of Brazil's confidence. Meanwhile, Obdulio Varela roamed behind them like a general, part defender, part psychologist. He barked orders, patted shoulders, argued with the referee, anything to keep his men's nerves sharp and Brazil's rhythm disrupted. When the crowd whistled or jeered, he smiled. It was his battlefield now. In the Brazilian camp, confusion had begun to spread. Their coach, Flavio Costa, gestured furiously from the touchline, urging calm, urging composure. But his players couldn't hear him. Over the noise, Ademir, the hero of the tournament, looked to Zizinho for answers, and for the first time, the maestro's face showed doubt. Zizinho had carried the hopes of a nation with the ease of a dancer all tournament. Now, his movements grew rushed, his passes slightly heavy. The pressure of inevitability had become unbearable. In the 74th minute, Brazil nearly reclaimed glory. Ademir surged into the box, twisting past Rodrigues Andrade, and unleashed a shot that brushed the post. The crowd gasped, 200,000 people inhaling hope, and then exhaled despair. The German observer felt the air leave the stadium. Momentum, he thought, is a living thing. He'd seen it in war, when the side that once looked unstoppable suddenly became human. Then came the 79th minute. Uruguay attacked again down the right. It began innocuously, a simple exchange between Perez and Gigia. Brazil's defenders, expecting a cross, dropped deeper, trying to contain the space. Gigia darted forward, Bigode lunged, but he was a second too late. The winger kept going. He looked up once, saw Schiaffino racing toward the penalty spot, saw Barbosa, the goalkeeper, shift slightly in anticipation of the pass, and then, without warning, he shot. A low drive, hard and sudden, at the near post. Barbosa lunged, a split second too slow. The ball slipped beneath his hand and struck the back of the net. Silence. For 200,000 people, time simply stopped. The drums ceased. The flags froze mid-wave. The only sound was Gigia's footsteps as he jogged away, his arm raised not in celebration, but in disbelief. The German closed his eyes. He knew that soundless moment, the moment when victory turns into loss and nobody has yet found the words to describe it. Uruguay 2, Brazil 1. Varela didn't celebrate. He ran to his men, shouting, "Focus! Don't lose your heads, play!" His authority was absolute. The team obeyed like soldiers following a command under fire. For the next 10 minutes, Brazil threw everything forward. Zizinho weaved, Ademir chased, Jaya crossed and crossed again, but the ball refused to fall kindly. Each attack ended in a desperate clearance, a block, a body thrown in the way. Uruguay's defense, once fragile, now looked impenetrable. Rodrigues, Andrade sliding to cover every angle, Maspoli catching every shot. The German could feel it in the air. Discipline, unity, faith. It was a fortress built not of tactics, but of will. And yet, amid the chaos, one man bore the unbearable weight of an entire nation. Moacir Barbosa, Brazil's dark-skinned goalkeeper, graceful, courageous, and proud, stood frozen. He stared toward the goal he had just failed to guard. The noise that began to rise around him wasn't anger yet, but disbelief, a sound that would, in time, turn into something crueler. The final whistle drew closer. Brazil attacked again. 1, 2, 3 desperate surges, but Uruguay refused to yield. The German found himself standing now, unable to sit, his pulse pounding with every clearance. He'd come expecting spectacle and found tragedy. When the referee finally blew his whistle, it didn't sound like an ending. It sounded like a wound being opened. No roar, no anthem, no celebration, just silence. The German looked across the stands. 200,000 faces, frozen in disbelief, mouths open but voiceless. On the pitch, the men in sky blue embraced quietly. Schiaffino sank to his knees. Gigia wept, and in the middle of it all, Obdulio Varela simply walked. He picked up the match ball, held it against his chest, and looked around the stadium. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He walked slowly, head high, through a sea of stunned faces. For the German, it was the most disciplined victory march he had ever seen. Silent, respectful, defiant. A captain leaving the battlefield victorious, but burdened by the cost of victory. In that silence, the maracana, built to celebrate glory, had become a cathedral of grief. The whistle had blown, yet no one moved. The maracana, once the beating heart of Brazilian joy, now stood petrified, a monument of silence. 200,000 souls suspended between disbelief and grief. The German in the stands didn't applaud, didn't even breathe. He'd seen nations collapse before, not with bombs or bullets, but with silence. That hollow quiet that comes when faith itself is broken. Tonight, he saw it again. Not on a battlefield, but on a football pitch. Brazil had lost, not by massacre, not by humiliation, but by something far crueler, by expectation turned to ashes. On the field, the victors barely celebrated. Obdulio Varela gathered his teammates and waved them to the tunnel, away from the erupting chaos. Some Brazilian players had fallen to their knees. Others stood motionless, eyes glazed, unable to comprehend the enormity of it. Goalkeeper Moacir Barbosa stared at the goal where the second ball had gone in. For a moment, he didn't move. The net still quivered slightly from Gigia's shot, as if mocking him. He bent down, touched the post with trembling fingers, and whispered to himself, "Why?" Up in the press box, journalists who had already written their victory headlines sat frozen, their typewriters idle. One foreign correspondent would later write, "Never in my life have I witnessed 200,000 people cry at once." Down on the grass, Obdulio Varela, ever the captain, refused to leave. The FIFA officials tried to rush the trophy presentation, but he waved them off. "No," he said, "we will wait. They deserve to have their ceremony, even if it's their funeral." He walked over to a cluster of Brazilian players, some crying, others staring at nothing. He approached Zizinho first, the elegant maestro whose artistry had lit up the tournament. Varela placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered, "You played like champions. You lost nothing." But Zizinho didn't look up. He would later say that was the day something inside him died, the joy, the magic, the innocence of football. Meanwhile, Alcides Gigia, the man who had struck the fatal blow, sat alone on the grass, his face buried in his hands. A journalist approached and asked what he felt. Gigia looked up, eyes wet, and said softly, "Only 3 people have ever silenced the maracana. Frank Sinatra, the Pope, and me." It wasn't pride. It was sorrow wearing the mask of irony. The German finally rose from his seat. Around him, Brazilians wept openly. Men, women, soldiers, children. A few simply stared blankly at the field, as though waiting for someone. To blow a whistle and start the match again. To undo the impossible. He descended slowly through the stands, his polished shoes echoing on the concrete. As he reached the exit tunnel, he glanced back one last time. The scoreboard still read, Brazil 1, Uruguay 2. It looked less like a scoreline and more like an epitaph. In the locker rooms beneath, the scenes were mirror images of 2 worlds. In Brazil's, silence reigned. Barbosa sat shirtless, staring at the floor, the towel over his knees untouched. Bigode cried uncontrollably, muttering apologies to no one in particular. Zizinho leaned against the wall, hollow-eyed, his voice breaking as he whispered, "We were supposed to be immortal." Upstairs, a government official had already torn up the victory speech prepared for President Dutra. The pre-printed banners reading Brazil World Champion 1950 were hastily removed from the tunnels. Even the radio commentators faltered, their words dissolving into disbelief. And in the opposite locker room, Uruguay's men stood still. They didn't sing. They didn't shout. They simply looked at one another, exhausted, dazed, half afraid to believe it had truly happened. Varela walked in last, the match ball still tucked under his arm. He placed it on the table, looked around, and said quietly, "We made history, boys. Now let's go home." It was victory without vanity. When the team finally emerged, escorted by police, the crowd parted in eerie silence. No boos, no stones, no anger. Just stunned, tearful faces. The Brazilian fans looked at the men in sky blue as if they were ghosts, who had walked through their dreams and stolen something sacred. The German lingered outside the stadium, the humid night air thick with disbelief. A boy nearby held a flag, clutching it to his chest like a wounded soldier clutching a fallen banner. The man wanted to speak to him, to tell him that this pain, this loss, would one day forge something greater. But he said nothing. Some truths, he knew, are born only in time. The following morning, Rio awoke to a funeral silence. Streets that had been painted yellow and green were now empty. The victory song, written and recorded days earlier, was never played again. The front pages bore only one word: tragedy. And, as the German read those headlines over breakfast, he realized he had not just witnessed a football match. He had witnessed a nation's heart breaking in real time. The maracanazo wasn't merely an upset. It was a myth being born in reverse, not through triumph, but through ruin. Because sometimes the greatest legends don't come from the winners. They come from those who lose and never forget why. In the days that followed, Brazil seemed to move through shadow. The carnival city, the city of song, laughter and light, fell silent. The flags that had once waved in triumph were pulled down, folded away like the memories people could not bear to see. Newspapers spoke of national mourning. The government cancelled celebrations, and President Dutra refused to hold any ceremony. The nation that had prepared a coronation found itself burying a dream instead. For the players, life would never be the same. Moisia Barbosa, the proud goalkeeper, became the living symbol of defeat. Once beloved, he was now haunted by that single near-post shot. In the markets and on the streets, strangers pointed. Decades later, he would tell a journalist, "In Brazil, the maximum prison sentence is 30 years. My sentence has lasted a lifetime." He was never forgiven. Though he had done nothing wrong, his name became an unspoken curse, a ghost lingering behind every new goalkeeper who wore the Brazilian jersey. Zizinho, the maestro who had been the heartbeat of Brazil's game, retreated into quiet bitterness. He played on, still brilliant, but the light was gone. He would tell friends that the joy of football had died that night. After the maracanazo, he said, "I was never the same man again." And yet, for Uruguay, the victory also carried an odd silence. There was no grand parade upon their return, no golden era that followed. The players were greeted warmly, yes, but modestly, as if even their own country couldn't quite comprehend the enormity of what they had done. Obdulio Varela returned to Montevideo a legend, but not a celebrity. He went back to work, living a simple life, content with anonymity. He never made money from his fame, never chased politics or endorsements. To him, that night had been about honor, not glory. When asked years later how he felt about the match, he simply said, "I did what had to be done." The German man who had watched from the stands, the quiet observer of nations and defeats, left Rio soon after, but the memory followed him. In letters written later to friends back in Europe, he described what he'd seen, not a football game, but a parable. He wrote, "It was as if a people had seen God, reached for his hand, and found it turning away." The maracanazo became more than an event. It became a mirror, a story told not to comfort, but to remind that pride and destiny walk hand in hand, and both can fall. For Brazil, the years that followed were years of reconstruction, not of stadiums, but of spirit. Coaches began to study the defeat, dissecting every tactical, emotional, and psychological fracture. The nation's football identity was reborn from that pain. Gone were the white shirts with blue collars. Brazil's Football Federation declared they would never wear them again. The new uniform, the golden yellow with green trim, was meant to symbolize rebirth, sunlight after the storm. And from that new dawn, a generation rose. Young boys who had cried that day, in Rio, Sao Paulo, Bahia, grew up obsessed with redemption. Among them was a small boy from Tres Coracos, named Edson Arantes do Nascimento, Pele. He would later say that he remembered his father weeping when Uruguay scored, and he promised him, "Don't cry, Papa. I'll win the World Cup for you one day." 8 years later, that boy would lift the trophy in Sweden, wearing the new golden shirt, and Brazil would become the nation of football it had always dreamed to be. The maracanazo, then, was not the end. It was the crucible, the fire that burned away illusion and left behind the steel of greatness. Still, for the men who lived it, the wound never truly healed. Barbosa died in quiet poverty, banned for decades from official Brazilian football functions. It was as if the country could not look at him without seeing the shadow of that goal. And yet, many who met him spoke of his gentleness, his grace, his forgiveness. "It wasn't my fault," he once said, "but I carried it because someone had to." In Uruguay, Obdulio Varela's legend only grew with time. Children learned his name as they learned their prayers. The captain, who stood against 200,000 voices and never bowed. His picture hung in bars in schools, in the hearts of men who believed that courage could change destiny. When he died in 1996, Uruguay's newspapers wrote a single line. On their front pages, "El negro jefe se fue, pero el maracanazo vive." The black chief has gone, but the maracanazo lives on. Even today, more than 70 years later, the echo of that night lingers in every football story told under the lights. Every upset, every underdog victory, every time a smaller team dares to dream, the word is whispered again, maracanazo. The German observer, now an old man, once told a journalist who found him living, "Quietly in Europe, that night taught me something that war never could. That courage is not only the act of fighting, it's the act of believing when the whole world tells you not to." The maracanazo endures because it reminds us of the fragility of perfection, that the beautiful game, like life itself, is never guaranteed. It is the story of one captain who refused to surrender, of one nation brought to its knees, and of the sport that would rise from its own heartbreak to conquer the world. For on that night in Rio, when 200,000 hearts broke, the soul of football was reborn. And as the German once wrote in his final letter, "Some nights belong not to the victors or the vanquished, but to history itself." July 16th, 1950, the night the world learned that even gods can bleed.